Imagine waking up in a world where people are frantically running with toilet paper. Plague doctors with masks roam the streets, and the sky is so dark that you think the sun has moved away on a vacation with no return ticket. No, this isn't the script of the next post-apocalyptic blockbuster, but real events that we humans have already survived. We're here, survivors of all those catastrophes. From plagues and volcanoes to tech glitches that turned out to be more inflated than balloons at a kid's party. Think about it. If the world really had to end every time something blew up, coughed, or when the sun took a break, we'd be living like Martians by now, only in our wildest imaginations. So let's take a look at the 10 apocalypses we've already survived and have a little laugh along the way about how humanity always finds its way back, even when it seems like our ride is over. Hold on tight. It's going to be a wild ride through history filled with ash, plagues, and stories that might make you laugh more than you'd expect from the end of the world. Y2K Bug, 1999. Picture this, it's the late 90s. People are rocking flannel shirts, and Walkmans are still cool. The world is gearing up for the turn of the millennium, but instead of just fireworks and big celebrations, a fear starts creeping in about an invisible enemy lurking inside all those computers that so cleverly run our world. The Y2K Bug. Or as the tech fearful of the time called it, the end of the world, version 1.0. Imagine the panic. People believed that as soon as the clock struck midnight on January 1st, 2000, all computers would crash, banking systems would fail, power plants would shut down, and planes would fall from the sky like confetti at a New Year's Eve party. What was actually going on? It all boiled down to a simple problem. Dates in older computer systems were recorded with just 2 digits, so 99 would suddenly become 00. To put it in human terms, it's like forgetting to add 1 letter in a text message, and instead of saying, "I'm coming," you end up saying, "I'm come." Simple, but it could have been crucial. How did it spread? Well, kind of like a game of telephone that started with, "Maybe something might go wrong," and ended with, "We're all going to die." News reports, TV debates, and even movies were filled with images of technology failing and turning into our biggest threat. People began stocking up on canned food, water, and batteries, because who knew what would happen when the lights went out? Was there panic? Oh, you bet there was. Programmers were working day and night to reprogram everything they could, and companies were hiring Y2K experts left and right. The whole world sat there waiting, with a glass of champagne in hand, but feeling way more nervous than usual. And then, nothing. Absolutely nothing. Computers just rolled over to the year 2000, like it was just another Monday morning. Planes stayed in the sky, bank accounts were still intact, and people drank their champagne with relief. Humanity collectively sighed and realized maybe we didn't need to panic quite so much. So, the Y2K bug, more like Y2K May. The end of the world didn't happen, but the panic was truly epic. In the end, it's a good reminder that even when our fears get a little out there, it doesn't always mean the end of the world. Tunguska Event, 1908. Now imagine waking up one fine morning in Siberia, ready for another typical day in the vast wilderness, when suddenly the sky lights up brighter than the sun, and boom! A deafening explosion rattles your bones, and the ground shakes like it's auditioning for the lead role in an earthquake movie. No, this isn't the opening scene of a new disaster film. It's the Tunguska Event of 1908. Where the universe decided to throw a cosmic temper tantrum right over the forests of Russia. The Tunguska Event was basically the equivalent of the universe saying, "Let's see what happens when I throw this rock really, really hard." A massive explosion occurred when a meteor or comet, about 50 to 60 meters in diameter, entered Earth's atmosphere and blew up mid-air over the Siberian taiga. The blast was so powerful that it flattened an estimated 2,000 square kilometers of forest, roughly the size of a big city like Tokyo. Trees were knocked down, roots up in the air, all lying in neat radial patterns pointing away from the explosion's epicenter. It's like the forest decided to play a massive game of dominoes, with nature itself flicking the first piece. Panic, not so much immediate since, let's be honest, there weren't too many people hanging out in that remote part of Siberia. But the shock waves were felt far and wide. People in villages hundreds of kilometers away reported seeing a bright flash, followed by a loud noise like artillery fire. Some thought the world was ending, while others assumed it was some angry gods practicing their thunderbolts. The blast was so intense, it was heard as far away as the UK, and seismographs registered it all across the globe. For days, the night skies were glowing strangely, and people as far away as Europe were reading their newspapers at night without needing a lamp. A bit too bright for comfort. Scientists of the time scrambled to figure out what the heck just happened. But with the site being so remote and hard to reach, it took nearly 2 decades before an expedition finally arrived on the scene. When they did, they found nothing but flattened trees, scorched ground, and absolutely no sign of an impact crater or any meteor fragments. It was as if whatever exploded just vanished. Cue the conspiracy theories. Was it a UFO? A secret weapon test? Nikola Tesla messing with his death ray? Spoiler alert, none of the above. Just a space rock that exploded with the force of 1,000 atomic bombs, but left no trace except a whole lot of splinters and unanswered questions. The Tunguska Event remains one of the weirdest, most powerful natural explosions in modern history, and while it could have been a true catastrophe if it had happened over a populated area, the main thing it did was give us a sense of how fragile our place in the universe really is. And maybe a little gratitude that when space throws a tantrum, sometimes it's kind enough to aim it at the empty parts of the map. Eruption of Krakatoa, 1883. Imagine you're in the middle of a regular day in Indonesia, when suddenly everything around you starts rumbling, the ground shakes, and above you rises a colossal pillar of ash and smoke that blocks out the sun. No, this isn't the plot of a bad sci-fi movie, but the reality of one of the most devastating volcanic eruptions in history, the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883. Krakatoa was usually a fairly calm volcano between Java and Sumatra, until the day it decided it had enough of its volcanic routine and cranked things up to the max. The explosion was so tremendous that it was heard as far away as Australia and Rodriguez Island near Madagascar, over 4,800 kilometers away. It was the loudest sound recorded in modern history, like your neighbor setting off a firecracker on New Year's Eve, but on steroids. This explosion wasn't just awe-inspiring, it was incredibly destructive. The eruption triggered giant tsunamis with waves up to 40 meters high, which wiped out coastal towns and villages, killing more than 36,000 people. And that's not all. Krakatoa spewed so much ash and gas into the atmosphere that global temperatures dropped, and the sky turned into surreal shades of red and orange for months. People in London and New York watched sunsets that looked straight out of an apocalyptic painting, not realizing that this beauty was the calling card of one very angry volcano. Panic? Absolutely. Imagine a wave coming out of nowhere and taking your town with it. And some people didn't even have time to say they should have had something lighter for dinner. Fire, ash, earthquakes, and massive waves. It all looked like the end of the world. Even the sky went crazy. It was like nature decided to host its own version of the purge. Krakatoa reminds us that while Earth is our home, it occasionally likes to show who's really in charge. And even though we thought we had nature under control, this eruption showed us that Mother Earth still has a few tricks up her sleeve that can catch us off guard. And if you ever feel like you're having a rough day, just think of those who survived Krakatoa, though they would probably advise you to run for the hills rather than look for a moral lesson in it. Eruption of Mount Vesuvius, 79 AD. Imagine you're in ancient Pompeii, enjoying a peaceful day with a glass of wine in hand, the sun is shining, and everything is fine. Suddenly the sky darkens, the ground starts to shake, and a massive cloud of ash, smoke, and scorching lava begins to pour out of the nearby Mount Vesuvius. This isn't the start of a tourist volcano tour, but the unexpected beginning of one of the most famous volcanic eruptions in history, which forever turned Pompeii and Herculaneum into tragic monuments. It was August 24th, 79 AD, when Vesuvius decided that after centuries of calm, it was time to let off some steam. But instead of a harmless puff of steam that might just ruin someone's picnic, Vesuvius went all out. The eruption was so powerful that it spewed countless tons of volcanic ash, gas, and lava into the air, burying entire cities. Pompeii, just a few kilometers from the volcano, was completely covered under several meters of ash and pumice, while Herculaneum was hit by scorching pyroclastic flows that obliterated everything in their path. Panic, absolute and total. People tried to flee, hide, find safety, but the speed and intensity of the eruption were unforgiving. Most of the inhabitants of Pompeii and Herculaneum had no chance to escape. Their bodies were preserved in the positions where the eruption caught them. Some were running, others crouching, praying. The scenes of these positions are now a chilling reminder of how quickly life can turn to ash. And how did the news of this catastrophe spread? Back then, there were no social media, no breaking news on CNN, just the shocking tales of those lucky enough to be far from the epicenter. The writings of Pliny the Younger, who observed the eruption from a safe distance, became some of the earliest reports on a volcanic eruption. The eruption of Vesuvius was a massive tragedy, but it also provided an incredible archaeological treasure. Cities preserved in time, like a museum of life in ancient Rome, where time stood still. This disaster reminds us that even when we feel safe in the shadow of a mighty mountain, nature always has the last word. And while Pompeii and Herculaneum were never rebuilt, their story and the silent testimonies of that day live on, teaching us about the fragility and randomness of life when nature decides to show its power. The Great Famine in Europe, 1315 to 1317. Imagine finding yourself in medieval Europe, where people care more about their fields than their Instagrams, and every day is a battle for food and survival. Then comes the year 1315, and suddenly it seems like the weather decides to take a break and mess everything up. The rains are relentless, winter drags on longer than healthy, and the crops? They simply decide not to show up that year. This is how the Great Famine in Europe begins, a series of events that made food a rare commodity and survival a daily lottery. It all started with an unusually cold and rainy spring that lasted into the summer. Fields turned into muddy swamps that refused to yield any crops. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, another disaster struck. Livestock began dying from diseases caused by the damp and cold. People desperately tried to save what they could, but nature didn't give them any breathing room. For 3 long years, from 1315 to 1317, it felt like an endless chain of rainy and cold months where even the most optimistic were losing hope. Panic? Absolute. In towns and villages, hunger started to rage. Food became so scarce that its price skyrocketed, and those who could afford it hoarded supplies like there was no tomorrow. For everyone else, the situation became hopeless. People ate whatever they could find, from grass and roots to shoe leather. There were even reports of cannibalism when desperation broke all boundaries. People turned to the church and prayed for salvation, but not even prayers could prevent the despair that followed. During these 3 years, millions of people died from hunger, diseases caused by malnutrition and weakness, and society crumbled under the weight of the crisis. Desperate people turned against each other, and crime rose as even the most law-abiding citizens resorted to theft just to have something to eat. The Great Famine was a harsh reminder of how much we depend on nature and how quickly everything can turn upside down when nature decides not to cooperate. Although the weather eventually improved and the crops returned, the scars from those years ran deep. So today, when we open a fridge full of food, we can be grateful that we don't live in times when every day was a fight for survival, and the only thing you could cook was the hope that tomorrow would be better. The day the Earth's pillars collapsed, 536 AD. Imagine it's the year 536, and you're living in a time that historians would later call the worst year to be alive. And when I say the worst, I mean truly terrible. Imagine the sun suddenly disappearing and the world plunging into darkness as if someone forgot to turn on the cosmic lights. It wasn't a cozy polar night, but a decade-long winter that wreaked havoc and suffering across the globe. Welcome to the year 536, the time when it seemed like the Earth's pillars had collapsed. It all started when several volcanoes in the northern hemisphere decided to go on a massive erupting spree. Volcanic dust and aerosols spread across the globe, creating a thick veil that blocked sunlight and caused temperatures to drop by several degrees Celsius. This led to worldwide crop failures. Winter lasted even in summer, and summer, well, it was just a colder version of spring. The sun looked more like a dim lamp behind a dirty window, and days were shrouded in a mystical fog. Panic? Of course there was panic. People thought the end of the world had come, a live biblical apocalypse. Famine, wars, and plagues spread like wildfire. Some chronicles spoke of yellow dust falling like snow, and people believed they were being punished by the gods, or that the sun had abandoned their world forever. In China, Mesopotamia, Europe, and the Americas, the whole world was in shadow. Entire civilizations were shaken, and many fell into oblivion. How did this news spread? Reports and tales of strange celestial phenomena, winter summers, and perpetual darkness spread quickly, and people started believing anything that could explain their misery. These were grim times, when even the best survival strategies turned into mere guesswork. It didn't matter whether you were an emperor, a peasant, or a scholar. The darkness affected everyone equally. The year 536 and the years that followed were among the worst climatic periods humanity has ever experienced. The weather only started to improve after a decade, but the marks of this period remained in chronicles and legends as a warning that even when we think we have everything under control, nature has its own plan. So, when we complain about bad weather or an overly long winter today, we can be grateful that we live in a time when the sun rises every day, and we don't have to fear it will leave us for a decade. The Plague of Justinian, 541 to 542 AD. Imagine living in Byzantine Constantinople, one of the world's greatest cities, where trade thrives, streets are full of life, and the empire is at the height of its power. Then, without warning, an invisible enemy sweeps in from the east, the Plague of Justinian. Swiftly and mercilessly, it spreads across the Mediterranean, turning cities into zones of death, and becoming one of the first recorded apocalyptic pandemics in history that changed the world. It all started in the ports. Infected rats arrived on ships from Egypt, carrying fleas filled with the deadly bacterium Yersinia pestis. The plague spread like wildfire, jumping from one ship to another, and then into cities where people crowded in narrow streets. There was no escape. Within months, Constantinople, with a population of around 500,000, began to resemble a horror movie come to life. It began subtly, a few sick people, then dozens, hundreds, thousands. People who were healthy in the morning were lying lifeless in the streets by evening. Typical symptoms included sudden fevers, swollen and painful lymph nodes, buboes, that could grow to the size of an orange, and black necrotic spots on the skin. When it spread to the lungs, the pneumonic form, the infection became airborne, killing its victims within days, sometimes just hours. Panic was immense. Emperor Justinian himself contracted the plague but miraculously survived. His subjects, however, were not so lucky. It is said that during the worst days, up to 5,000 people died daily in Constantinople, with some accounts claiming as many as 10,000. Within a year, about 40% of the city's population, roughly 200,000 people, had died. The total death toll across the empire is estimated at 25 to 50 million, representing up to half of the population of Europe, Asia, and North Africa. The city was overwhelmed with bodies. Graves were filled to capacity, and soon there was no room left for burials. Thousands of bodies were simply thrown into the sea or into mass graves outside the city. An unbearable stench of death filled the streets. The black flag of death instilled terror in the hearts of everyone who witnessed people collapsing in agony, begging for a salvation that never came. The economy collapsed. The military strength of the empire weakened, allowing enemies to invade and cause further chaos. The Byzantine Empire, which had ambitions to restore the glory of the Roman Empire, was plunged into a crisis from which it never fully recovered. The empire was weakened, cities depopulated, and the roads that once carried great caravans of traders were now guarded only by the empty, desperate eye sockets of the dead. The Plague of Justinian reminds us that when a pandemic strikes, humanity can be powerless, and even the greatest empires are not immune to an invisible enemy. This dark chapter is a warning that beneath the veneer of civilization lies the fragility of human life, which can be destroyed by a single bacterium, creeping in the shadows, carrying with it the specter of death. The Spanish flu, 1918 to 1919. Imagine it's the end of World War I. The world is finally catching its breath after years of suffering. But quietly, a new, even greater threat is approaching, not on the battlefields, but in city streets, villages, and every home. The Spanish flu. This pandemic hit the world with such force that in just 2 years, it killed more people than the war itself. And what made it worse, it didn't target the elderly or weak, but the young, strong people who were meant to rebuild the world after the war. The pandemic began in March 1918 and spread almost everywhere humans lived, from Europe, America, Africa, to distant Pacific islands. It was called the Spanish flu, not because it originated in Spain, but because, as a neutral nation during the war, Spain didn't block news reports about its spread. Other countries were busy censoring information to avoid causing panic during the war, while Spanish newspapers openly reported on the looming threat. At first, the symptoms seemed harmless: coughing, fever, muscle aches, much like the regular flu, but soon after came rapid deterioration. Lungs filled with fluid, people struggled to breathe, and in some cases, their skin turned blue, a sign of a lack of oxygen. Hospital wards were filled with young and healthy people who, just hours earlier, had been able to work, now fighting for each breath. Panic? Yes, and it was justified. The flu hit cities like a tsunami. Schools closed, churches were empty, and bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Cities became silent graveyards. Many died at home with no one to care for them. Streets were disinfected with chemicals, people wore masks, and governments banned public gatherings. But none of it was enough. At the height of the pandemic, tens of thousands of people were dying every day. It's estimated that the Spanish flu infected about a third of the world's population, around 500 million people. Out of this staggering number, approximately 50 to 100 million died, making it one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. And what was most terrifying? The flu primarily targeted young adults, often between the ages of 20 and 40, in the prime of their lives. Those who survived the war returned home, only to face a deadly virus. Families who had hoped their loved ones would return from the front lines lost them to the flu instead. It was as if the world wasn't greeted by peace after the war, but by another wave of horror. The Spanish flu reminds us that the greatest threats often don't come with drums and trumpets, but in the silence that surrounds us when we think it's all over. Today, after going through another pandemic, we can better understand how fragile human existence is and how easily history can repeat itself, teaching us that health is the greatest wealth we can have. The Black Death, which occurred from 1347 to 1351, imagine Europe in the 14th century. A world on the verge of change, cities growing, trade flourishing, and medieval society experiencing its peak. And then, out of nowhere, an invisible enemy appears, spreading faster than any conqueror before it. This enemy, known as the Black Death, sweeps across Europe and turns it into one massive graveyard. The Black Death was a pandemic that raged from 1347 to 1351, killing 75 to 200 million people across Europe, Asia, and North Africa, wiping out approximately 30 to 60% of Europe's population. In some areas, 2/3 of the population perished. The disease spread mercilessly and quickly, leaving behind devastation, death, and fear. The pandemic began in the Far East, likely in China or Mongolia, and made its way to Europe via trade routes. In 1347, merchant ships from Crimea docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. Carrying more than just goods, aboard were rats and fleas infected with the deadly bacterium Yersinia pestis. From there, the disease quickly spread across the Mediterranean and further north, disregarding borders or social status. The Black Death came in 3 forms: bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic. The most common was the bubonic form, which caused swollen and painful lymph nodes called buboes that appeared on the neck, armpits, and groin. These swellings often turned into black necrotic sores, giving the disease its name. Other symptoms included high fever, chills, vomiting, and severe pain. Death usually occurred within a few days of the first symptoms appearing. The pneumonic form was even more deadly as it spread through the air, easily infecting entire families and communities without direct contact with the infected. While the bubonic form relied on flea bites to spread the bacteria, the pneumonic form transmitted through airborne droplets from the sick. As the plague struck towns and villages, people fell into a state of terror and hopelessness. Cities quickly filled with dead bodies. Gravediggers couldn't keep up, and many bodies were simply thrown into mass graves. Churches and hospitals were overflowing, and although priests and monks tried to care for the sick, they often succumbed to the disease themselves. The plague didn't just attack physical health. Society was thrown into complete disarray. Many families abandoned their sick relatives in the hopes of saving themselves. Priests refused to perform funerals out of fear for their own lives, and towns and villages isolated themselves from one another in a desperate attempt to prevent the disease's spread. In some areas, riots and anti-Semitic violence erupted, as Jews were falsely blamed for spreading the disease. Thousands were murdered in pogroms. The Black Death destroyed the European economy. With vast losses in population, the labor force shrank, leading to a shortage of workers in agriculture and crafts. Many towns and villages were abandoned, fields were left unplowed, and trade came to a halt. The shortage of food and goods led to inflation and social tension. Society was falling apart. People lost faith in governments and the church, which could neither explain nor stop the spread of the disease. The suffering was so immense that many believed the world was ending. Flagellants, people who publicly whipped themselves in acts of penance, became a common sight in cities and villages, believing that only severe punishment could avert God's wrath. The biggest threat is already here. What do you think? When we talk about the biggest threats, many of you might think of the Black Death, World War II, or climate change. But what if I told you that the number one biggest threat is already happening? And it's not just one single disaster. It's a combination of ongoing crises, climate change, economic issues, wars, pandemics, and technological risks, all merging into one giant chain of events that could impact all of humanity. What do you think? Do you believe climate change is the biggest danger, or are wars and social tensions the real threat? Maybe you're concerned that technology, artificial intelligence, or cyber attacks could take control. There are so many theories and even hoaxes out there, but let's focus on the real dangers we already see unfolding. What if these threats start overlapping? Climate change causes migration, which leads to conflicts, and technology failures could collapse our infrastructure. How would we handle a situation where all of these crises come together into one massive global disaster? Whether we're talking about ancient pandemics, modern wars, or future threats, the question that remains is the tension really building, or is it just the internet, where you mostly read negative news, creating this feeling?